After World War II, post-war Europe was in a rough spot, having the economy being ruined and millions dead. With the US and Russia only being aligned through means to destroy the Nazis, they both became superpowers post-war and had major decisions on what to do with post-war Europe.
With Stalin ruling Russia at the end of World War II and Harry S. Truman taking over after FDR or Franklin D. Roosevelt's surprise death, they saw just how much they didn't have in common. This caused tensions to rise and a rivalry to begin. They both saw their ways as the only way and couldn't just leave it alone. This sparked Truman to employ the Truman Doctrine, which was economic and military aid for countries fending off communism, as well as the Marshall Plan, which provided economic aid for countries after the war, trying to paint the U.S. in a better light. Both of these are a part of the idea of containment, which was employed trying to stop the spread of communism by creating alliances and helping weak countries to resist Soviet advances. Nikita Khrushchev was the first secretary of the Communist Party. He believed that communism would rule over capitalism. However, he did not agree with Stalin's way of ruling things, so he removed everything Stalin did. This was called de-Stalinization. Then came JFK, who found out that Russia was creating missile sites in Cuba. They avoided war by creating a quarantine of Cuba and got Russia to stop. It became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was the closest we've gotten to nuclear war. It scared Nixon, and after going into office, created détente, an act of friendship where we tried to make friends with communist countries and create a better relationship. Gorbachev then employed glasnost, a Soviet policy of openness, a free flow of ideas and information, as well as perestroika, a restructuring of the Soviet economy to permit more local decision-making, and democratia, introduction of free elections, multi-candidate, not multi-party, for the Communist Party. Then Reagan came and chose intimidation with his Star Wars, or the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. Reagan didn't actually have the technology at the time, and we are just starting to barely use something close today. But it worked as it was designed, a deterrent that helped keep the Soviets from launching a nuke.
Russia played a big part in the war, and the Allies respected them for it. However, Stalin had other plans, using their sympathy as a weapon against them to spread communism. Although Russia endured hardships during the war, its form of government stayed afloat, persuading other countries to try communism. Russia also started to spread propaganda throughout the world, putting communism in the spotlight and making democracy look bad compared to them. The Allies noticed this and started taking measures to prevent the spread of communism by forming an alliance and making several foreign policies. To counter this, Russia made its alliance with all of its satellite countries called the Warsaw Pact. This pressured nearby countries to convert to communism, as well as put a stop to the spread of democracy within their borders. With this, the USSR was officially formed, but that wasn't the only thing that Russia did to help spread communism. They also divided East and West Germany with an Iron Curtain. Things like the Berlin Wall separated families, blocked West Berlin from getting the supplies that they needed, and prevented people from escaping communism. In addition, the USSR started to use brinksmanship to sink fear into the hearts of NATO countries, and they backed up this fear by constructing nuclear weapons at the same rate and quality as the US. The Soviets also showed off their lead in technology by creating the first ever satellite named Sputnik, which began the space race. Both sides of the war poured billions of dollars into constructing spacecrafts. This would help to spread communism throughout the world, as whoever has the best technology, the better their form of government looks. However, America had won, which only weakened the Soviets' spread of communism, as well as digging a hole in their economy. However, this did not slow down its spread after Russia began persuading leaders in foreign countries outside of Europe to join their side. They began with China, which was a great success as the democratic side of China retreated to Taiwan. Then came North Korea and Vietnam, which were considered hot wars. Both sides struggled in these wars, leading to a draw in Korea, permanently dividing both sides, and a hard-fought victory in Vietnam, which mostly consisted of the US pouring more and more soldiers into the Democratic side and the Viet Cong using guerrilla tactics to win. It made the US look particularly bad, as a lot of the country was destroyed afterward, which people blamed democracy for. However, after these hot wars, Russia realized the difference in ideologies between them and China. This led to a few border disputes, as well as their change from allies to acquaintances. But this didn't stop Russia from beginning to spread communism in Latin America, mostly in Cuba and Chile. The Soviets were successful and began moving missiles into Cuba to get them within range of America. This was fueled by America having a similar stock of missiles in Turkey. This was known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was the closest the world was to global destruction. The US formed a naval blockade and threatened Soviet ships attempting to pass through. Tensions were high after America failed in the Bay of Pigs invasion. This dispute was solved after both leaders decided to remove their missiles in both locations. Afterward, several satellite countries within the USSR began revolting after the newly made policies of Gorbachev. With these newly found rights, people began to revolt, and since Russia was spending most of its money on grain in hopes of stabilizing the economy, Russia could not properly shut down the rebellions. Most of the problems that the satellite countries had were due to Russia exploiting them for their resources and forcing them to go to war. However, the true end of the USSR was when the Berlin Wall fell, allowing both sides to be reunited and Russia losing almost all of its ground in Europe.
The US and Russia after World War II realized that they had different ideas for post-war Europe. Russia planned to spread their ideals of communism throughout the world, and the US wanted to stop Russia from doing so. So they planned to do something called containment, which basically means to stop communism from spreading. To help the stop of expansion, the US helped out post-war Europe recover, making people favor capitalism over communism. The ways the US helped were doing such as the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Post-war Germany was split up between the US, France, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The main section split was between the East and West, the East being where the Soviet Union took power. This divided Europe, creating an Iron Curtain. The people in the East Germany didn't like being under Soviet control, so some left, but this ended up making Russia start a blockade in East Germany, keeping them captive. People couldn't leave or enter, or could have trade. The people were starving on the streets of East Berlin, so the US went to go fly over troops and drop goods for the people to have in East Germany, and it was known as the Berlin Airlift. After a while, the borders were opened up for trade. Sometime later, the US and other allied countries formed NATO. NATO was made so if one country went into war or was attacked, all the other allied countries would go and support that one. Russia made a NATO-like contract as well a while later. Sometime later, Russia got some inside information on how the nuclear weapons made by the US, like the ones dropped in Japan in World War II, were made, and successfully demonstrated that they could use the nukes. The US decided to make even a more powerful bomb, which was the hydrogen bomb. It was so powerful that the US never decided to drop it on anyone. Next, Russia planned to spread communism to China, with the Soviets supporting the communist side under leader Mao Zedong, and the US supporting the nationalist side. Mao and his side won over, and most nationalists that were kicked out of China and moved to Taiwan, where more nationalists fled to. After World War II, Korea was split up in two by the Soviet Union and the US. It was at the 38th parallel, and the capitalistic ideas were in the South. North Korea was influenced by communism heavily, and North Korea was fighting to take control of South Korea. This started the Korean War. North Korea was invading the South, and there were concerns that China, also being a communist country and a nearby one at that, would step into the fight. So General Douglas MacArthur wanted to get permission to drop a nuke in China so they won't have time to invade. For that, he was decommissioned after. After 3 years, Russia and the US both decided to cease fire and left both North and South Korea bordered at the 38th parallel. The border being the same spot helped show that nothing came out of the war. Vietnam too broke off and became free around this time. The North was communist and South was being anti-communist. The US went to go help stop the spread because of something called the domino theory. The domino theory is how communism would spread into other countries like an infection. The war lasted so long, till 9 years into the war, the US was only helping from afar. But after 2 North Vietnamese sunk 2 US ships, the US had to send troops into the fight. After a couple more years, the people of America did not like the death in the war anymore. So the current president, Nixon, did a tactic where he slowly pulled troops out of the war called Vietnamization. South Vietnam fell into communism 2 years later, with no nearby countries falling under communism. Nixon did some other things in office though, such as doing detente. He did things like visiting communist China while still being in office and signing the SALT Treaty, which limited nuclear capabilities of both Russia and the US. After Nixon, next was Jimmy Carter. 2 years into his term, he signed another SALT treaty which limited both superpowers even more. When Ronald Reagan became president, he practically erased all the progress Nixon did to loosening tensions, because he timed them again by doing things such as calling the Soviets evil and more things. Luckily, by now the Cold War was coming to an end, with the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union falling.
The relationship between the United States and Russia is very fragile. While Russia is still free from communism, they are not free from a dictatorship under their president Putin. Putin, who first came to power in 1999, has been consistently keeping his power through tactics such as silencing his critics with violence, using political maneuvers, and changing laws. More specifically, his changing of the Russian constitution to allow him to run for presidency after the term limits were over, which has let him repeat the process to stay in office longer by using loopholes and new rules. The strategy has worked in his favor, and he is currently in his second consecutive 6-year term. Meanwhile, in the US, we've kept our constitution unchanged with a still 4-year long term limits, with only 2 being allowed. Trade in between the US and Russia was allowed until the war in Ukraine. The US has sent aid via sending troops and supplies, which, with that and prior conflicts between the Russia and the US, have been the main causes to the ceasing of trade in between the two nations. The ceasing of trade has had an effect on the US market, with prices of things such as oils like gasoline and plastics that are made with those oils going up as a result. The US has been trying to get Russia to cooperate with them to end the conflict, but Russia has been stiff in their decision-making. The conflict is still continuing with no sign of the war ending soon. Some have estimated that Russia may be able to sustain the war for at least 3 more years, but is still unknown.